We ended the last lecture at the end of the 16th century in Italy. Now we return to the 15th century so that we can focus on events in Northern Europe. In contrast with the Italians, who primarily painted in tempera and fresco, Northern Europeans painted with oil, and oil allowed them to perfect their depictions of exquisite detail and textures. Northern Europeans are more interested in portraits of individuals, and they are also interested in intricate symbolism. The art that we will see will capture as well the spiritual visions of their donors. In addition, technological innovations such as the printing press are extremely important and change the fabric and trajectory of society. The printing press influenced the spread of the Reformation, which then in turn influenced the direction of art in Northern Europe. As we move from the 15th century to the 16th, we will see the impact then of Italian art as well on the art of Northern Europe. The Northern Renaissance would not have been possible without the patronage of the prosperous middle class. In Flanders, present-day Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, merchants created an urban middle class that could pay for art. But this does not mean that the nobility stopped buying art, such as these works commissioned in the International Gothic style. The International Gothic style is known for minute detail. It also uses intuitive perspective rather than the mathematical perspective in the 15th century that we saw in Italy. During the This book, The Très Riche Heure of the Duc de Berry, is made for a duke. And let's continue to put into practice the 4 steps to understanding a work of art. Art history asks us to observe the way the art looks, its formal properties, the meaning and content of the work, its symbolism, and to investigate what the work tells us about the cultural context in which it was made. The first thing we notice about the way this work looks is that it's very small, only 8.5 by 11 inches about. The Très Riche Heures of the Duke of Berry is a calendar. It has alternating scenes of court and peasant life in different seasons. You can examine the feast scenes depicted for January. How does this manuscript illumination convey the power and authority of the Duke? Well, on the right side, we see the Duke at a lavish table of food. He's incredibly well dressed. There are vibrant colors of high intensity, high saturation. They create almost a decorative pattern on the page. In contrast, on the left, we have the image for February, which shows a muted winter scene with peasants. The peasants are happy in this hierarchical society. And remember, this image is made for the Duke, and so the peasants are more likely to be portrayed as happy. An interesting detail is that of the peasants exposing themselves before the fire. You can see that detail if you look closely. 2 aspects of the International Gothic style that converge in this image are its interest in domestic space and spiritual space. We are looking through 2 windows. The image itself is a window, and within the image there is another window, looking on Mary of Burgundy's vision. The transparent veil and glass and dog are extremely well depicted. They are domestic objects, and this spiritual vision of Mary depicted in this image comes to her, not while she's at Mass, but in her private devotion, with the help of her Book of Hours, a devotional book, so that she can have a private spiritual experience. The Marode altarpiece shows a domestic space as well, which is also a spiritual scene. This is a contemporary Flemish interior, but it depicts the Annunciation, the moment when Gabriel announces to Mary that she is going to be the vessel for the incarnation of God. This seems to be a scene used with everyday objects, but they are in fact symbolic. Some historians refer to them as disguised symbols because they are everyday objects with deeper meaning, hidden meaning. Gabriel has just landed in the room. The flutter of the pages of the book indicate the stir of air caused by the landing. The baby Jesus is hard to see in this image, but is riding on beams of light straight for Mary's womb. Another symbol of virginity is the enclosed garden, and where the donors are kneeling, and the flowers potentially symbolize Mary as well. The unfocused eyes of the donors mean that they are directing their contemplation inward. Again, this is an inward vision. This biblical story is presented in a present-day workshop. They can imagine these events happening in their own lives and in their own day and time. The mouse trap symbolizes Christ as the trap for Satan. And the board that Joseph is making, as you can see here, is used for wine, referring to the Eucharist. So this image shows that understanding the symbolism of an image can be very important for an art historian to understand what this image is all about, or any image. The Annunciation is an oil painting. And oil had been used since the 12th century and provided for certain possibilities. For one thing, tempera paint, which was preferred in Italy, dried quickly and did not allow for subtle gradations of value, which are afforded by oil paint, because oil paint dries much more slowly, and that means you can move that paint around and blend it. It can be adjusted. So the oil is also translucent, which means that layers can be applied that are semi-transparent, which creates a luminous quality to the painting. Flemish painters are able to depict furs and fabrics and shiny or translucent objects like metal or glass with striking realism. And let's look more closely at another remarkable aspect of oil paint, which is the depiction of human flesh. Jan van Eyck lived from about 1390 or 95 to 1441, and oil paint allowed him to render human flesh very realistically. He's even able to depict his stubble in this painting. The folds of the turban are also exquisite. This may have been a self-portrait, since his motto, "As I can, not as I would," forms an anagram of his name. A piece that unites the symbolism of Northern European painting, the preference for domestic interiors, and the virtuosic use of oil paint is the Arnolfini wedding, pictured here. Luxury objects reveal the wealth of the person commissioning the painting. Giovanni Arnolfini was a wealthy merchant rather than a noble landowner. Wealth could now be made through trade. Not only do we see the colors and the exquisitely detailed renderings of fur or the light on the chandelier, we also, with a little bit of knowledge, can learn what the objects in the painting symbolize. The painting may have been a marriage contract, a witness of the event of a marriage. The man has his hand up as if he is taking an oath. The artist signs the back wall with his name, and the artist is also reflected in the mirror. Perhaps the artist is a witness to the marriage. The couple is obviously prosperous. Ordinary household objects might have symbolic meaning. This may be another case of disguised symbolism. Only one candle is lit in the chandelier, which represents the presence of Christ as the witness of a marriage. The one candle might also represent unity, like the unity candle in a wedding. The couple have removed their shoes, which represents sacredness, because Moses took off his shoes when he encountered God in the burning bush, because he was on holy ground. So here they're on holy ground before a sacred sacrament, the sacrament of marriage. The dog represents fidelity, traditionally. The woman looks pregnant, representing her ability to bear children and be fruitful in this union. That's why there's a bed as well. The orange fruit on the windowsill represents the innocence of Adam and Eve before the fall. Now, art historians, of course, make their living debating the meaning of works of art, and so despite everything I have said about this symbolism, some art historians argue that none of these objects represent any of these things. These interpretations are still up for debate. The Ghent altarpiece shows in incredible detail. We have God, Mary, John the Baptist, Adam and Eve, musical angels, Christ, the Lamb on the altar, a landscape with atmospheric perspective in the background, saints, apostles, martyrs, pilgrims, all adoring Christ, the fountain of life. Now let's turn to the Deposition. It's an emotionally dramatic painting. Each figure has a different reaction to the death of Christ. Mary is ashen white. Her pose mimics that of Jesus. John has a distant stare. The woman behind him cries believable tears. Let's see if I have a detail of that. Here we go. Mary Magdalene wrings her hands. Compositionally, the formal elements of color and shape and line create a dynamic composition. The curves of Christ's body command attention. A repetition of white within the painting guides the eye towards Christ. The complexity of the embroidery on the cloth of Joseph of Arimathea and Mary Magdalene counterbalance the weight of the larger number of figures on the left. Red and green are balanced. Mary is the only one in bright blue, which also commands attention. So compositionally, it's a very interesting and dynamic piece. This image, called St. Luke drawing the Virgin and Child, refers to a legend in which the Virgin and Child appeared to Luke so that he could depict them. This is a celebration and legitimization of the profession of the artist. It also might be a self-portrait, and van der Weyden's legitimization of himself. He's facing the Virgin and Child reverently. He's kneeling. They, for their part, look like real people, like a real nursing mother and child, and a playful infant. The room, as in many Northern European paintings, opens onto a vista with atmospheric perspective. Martin van Nieuwenhove is a 24-year-old from a wealthy family in Bruges, and he commissions this diptych by Hans Memling. This is a devotional image of the Virgin and Christ child appearing in a vision to Martin. You can see how his eyes are not focused. They're not focused on her or anything really, because he's experiencing an internal vision. He is in the middle of private prayer, guided by, again, his Book of Hours. And the vision is happening in his own domestic space. The apple is a symbol of Christ as the new Adam, the second Adam who reversed the sin and curse of death of the first Adam. The first Adam ate the apple. Christ reverses that curse. Mary is the new Eve, and the two panels of the diptych separate the characters, but the two paintings are also united. You can see how the fabric of Mary's cape crosses the frame into Martin's space. And the convex mirror behind Mary performs the same function of uniting the characters because it reflects both of them. That's here. So we've seen the characteristics of Flemish art in the 15th century. It's full of symbolic meaning. Artists used oil paint to render textures and detailed objects, and many paintings depict religious visions and domestic interiors, or both. Now we will look at a new technology that develops in the 15th century, and that is the Gutenberg movable type press. The printing press revolutionized the circulation of information. The technology would drastically reduce the cost of printing books and would eventually lead to higher literacy rates throughout Europe. These books were often illustrated, as shown here, with woodcuts or engravings. Books were made more quickly than they had when monks were copying them by hand, so now ideas could spread. They could spread quickly, which was a factor in the spread of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. We will turn to the 16th century in Northern Europe now. In the 16th century, we will continue to see the depiction of intensely emotional spirituality. We will look at the impact of the Reformation, the impact of Italian art, and also the continuity between the 15th century Northern European art and that of the 16th century. So here's where we are. Matthias Grunewald continued the tradition of medieval mysticism within his art. His paintings are not analytical observations of the natural world that we saw in the Italian Renaissance. Instead, he's attuned to the emotions and to spiritual realities. His work, the Eisenheim Altarpiece, was at a hospital. It's a hospital that cares for patients with skin diseases, which is important when you look at the way that Christ is depicted. Opening and closing the altarpiece offer different views. So this is when you open it, and this is when you open it again. It opens 3 times. So here it is closed, here it is open for the first time, and then you can open again and get this view. So on the weekdays, the image of the crucifix was visible. Jesus has this tortured body, potentially like those of the patients at the hospital. Mary, again, has gone white. But now when you open it on Sunday, it would be opened on feast days, and on Sundays, everything would change. Sunday is a symbolic day of the resurrection. It's like mini Easter every week. Feast days are also days of celebration, and so the altarpiece would be open on feast days so that people could forget their illness, instead turn their gaze on a heavenly vision of bright color, a vision of the future that Mary will enjoy as the Queen of Heaven, and the resurrection that could facilitate a mystical experience and the healing of the body. The impact of Italian art on the arts of Northern Europe in the 16th century becomes strong when Northern European artists begin to travel. And the most famous example of this is Albrecht Dürer. He goes to Italy not only to transform his style, but also to begin to observe nature, and also to transform the idea of the artist. So when he goes to Italy, he gains a sense of the artist as a noble intellectual and an artistic genius. This image of himself shows him as Christ. This is a case in point of this transformation of the artist as an important individual. Dürer has a force of personality, much like that of Michelangelo. And like Michelangelo, with Dürer, the artist is no longer a laborer, but this inspired genius. Here he's presented face on, like many images of Christ, and his fingers are in the position of blessing. Although, at the same time, this may not be as prideful of an image as we might think, since it could also simply portray the belief that the faith will become like Christ as they grow in maturity. Along with the Italian values of harmony and balance reflected in the symmetry of the piece. Okay, can I just start over? Albrecht Dürer goes to Italy, and not only is his style impacted, along with classical influences, the close observation of nature, he also returns with a new conception of the artist. From Italy, he gains a sense of the artist as a noble intellectual and an artistic genius. This image of himself as Christ is a case in point. Dürer has a force of personality, much like that of Michelangelo. And like Michelangelo, with Dürer, the artist is no longer a laborer, but an inspired genius. This image shows him presenting himself face on to the viewer, like many images of Christ, and his fingers are in the position of blessing. It might not be, however, as prideful as we might think when we consider the fact that the faithful aim to become like Christ as they grow in maturity. Along with the Italian values of harmony and balance reflected in the symmetry of this piece, he also continues the northern love of sumptuous and meticulously observed surface detail. Look at the fur and the locks of hair, for example. Dürer is known for his incredible woodcuts. The attention to detail is exemplified by this image of the four horsemen of the Apocalypse. Here we have an engraving from 1504, and we see his interest in Italian art and ancient Roman and Greek copies. You can almost see how these look like ancient Roman sculptures. The figures are idealized and muscular, but he is still always northern, which is betrayed by the delicate renderings of detailed foliage and animals. The Protestant Reformation began within Dürer's lifetime. Here's an image of Luther and his wife Katharina von Bora. In 1517, this Augustinian monk, Luther, posted his 95 Theses. He was particularly angry that the Roman Catholic Church was selling indulgences to finance the renovation of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Thus, images are at the heart of his reforms. The medieval devotional practices of venerating saints and their images had, according to Luther, become idolatrous. Popes had great power and spent extravagant amounts of money. And Luther reminded believers, who could now read their Bibles that were printed on the Gutenberg press, that they could have direct access to God through Christ without the mediation of popes, priests, or saints. But Luther does not support the destruction of images. Other reformers, such as Zwingli, go much further and believe that there is no role for images in the worship space. So what changes about the way that artists make art in the midst of this religious turmoil? An important artist is Lucas Cranach, who lived from 1472 to 1553, and he is Luther's favorite artist. In the Wittenberg altarpiece from 1517, the crucified Christ is at the center between the preacher proclaiming the word and the congregation. So the crucified Christ becomes present to the congregation through the proclamation of the word. Christ is the word, and Christ is at the center of the congregational experience. Although Luther himself appreciated religious images, other reformers did not, as I mentioned. With religious images now being destroyed by some reformers, what options do artists have? Artists had to find other patrons outside the church. Perhaps unsurprisingly then, artists turned towards secular subjects, such as portraiture and still life. Small paintings for homes became popular, and growing wealth in Northern Europe means that artists have plenty to do because they are creating these luxury items for the market. But there's still a place for spirituality. How, then, can art be a vehicle for spiritual experience? It can if the landscape alone, without religious subject matter, can evoke a sense of divine presence. Albrecht Altdorfer creates an image that evokes this longing for mystery. It is now satisfied in the landscape. This is the Danube landscape, and the underlying power and mystery of the sky and the trees and mountains in this landscape reveal an understanding of God's presence in creation. So as we saw, Dürer was influenced by Italian art. He was a humanist. But in contrast, we have someone like Hieronymus Bosch, who created fantastical scenes that remind us of the medieval period rather than the Renaissance. Bosch was a mystic and a social critic, and this is a confusing and strange painting. We have Adam and Eve on the left with God, and in the middle is Earth with huge fruits of sexuality and fertility. And in hell, there are sensual pleasures which become instruments of torture. Perhaps the center is an image of paradise before the fall. Perhaps alchemy, the process of trying to turn common metals into gold, is a parable for Christ turning humans into spiritual gold. The fountain at the center of the lake could be an alchemical chamber to enact such a transformation. It almost looks like a futuristic alien landscape. Peter Bruegel, the elder, again paints a landscape. And the landscape now is the main focus of the painting, not the other subject matter. Bruegel traveled to Italy, but there the mountains rather than the art influenced him the most. As you can see, these great mountains in this painting. Religious subjects are less prominent due to this influence of the Reformation. The turn is instead to a painting of people working on the land with jagged mountains in the background. We see the relationship between this painting and that of the Limburg brothers. One similarity is the idealized depiction of peasants shown in paintings for the wealthy who either idealized their lifestyle or, on the other hand, maybe liked images of people working happily for them. And we can turn now briefly to England. Here's another image by Peter Bruegel with the peasants working. We can turn now briefly to England, where Hans Holbein was a talented painter who used his skill to do court portraits. He avoided religious conflict altogether by focusing on the court. The Ambassadors touches subtly on religious conflict. However, the top shelf is full of symbols of the heavens, such as tools for observing the sky, whereas the bottom shelf relates to worldly concerns. The lute has a broken string representing the broken harmony of the church. There's also a Lutheran hymnal, perhaps relating to George of Seville, Bishop of Lavar's sympathies towards the Protestants. This could be viewed as a celebration of the opulence of two powerful young men, and it also may be a critique of worldly wealth, particularly indicated by the anamorphic skull in the foreground. If one has to stand at a certain vantage point in order to the skull to enter into focus, into the right perspective.